Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's Mr. Eschbacher here. Time for another APUS history lecture. As Christmas break winds down in the year 2024, think about all the work that you have to put in around the holidays, trimming the tree, cooking, the cleaning, wrapping presents. And, if we're going to talk about work, it's time to talk about the American labor movement. Organized labor, sometimes called unions.
Working 9 to 5.
Don't wonder why your teachers go crazy, by the way, but I remember, oh my gosh, about 20 years ago, I had a kid on a Regents essay write about organized labor, and she proceeded to tell me in a huge essay, I'm talking about a page and a half, why it was so important for hospitals to be organized when women went into labor, so that way babies would be safe. Organized labor means unions. As you know, we've been talking about the rise of industrialization in the United States. Big corporations, trusts, monopolies, and robber barons are captains of industry. But we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the people who actually made the industrialization happen, the working man. It's important to understand that industrialization brought big changes, not just in how stuff was made, but in terms of class distribution, in terms of what people did for a living. For one thing, industrialization led to an increase in the middle class. As you have more factories, you need more people to be factory managers, so you had a middle class develop. Another big continuity throughout period 6 when we talk about industrialization is the idea that as time went on, food production increased from 1870 to 1900. And my crack producer John will put this slide up here that says labor force distribution. The percentage of people who were farmers decreased. From 1870 to 1900, it went from 32% of the population as farmers down to 25.3%. And that trend would continue as less and less people were farmers, yet food production increased. The American labor force in general changed. Again, in 1870, you're talking about half the people somehow being involved in agriculture, not just farmers, but somehow being involved in agriculture. And by 1910, that had dropped down to 31%. Meanwhile, industries like manufacturing and construction went up from 23% to 29%. Commerce, aka shipping, increased from 11% to 19%. So people left the farms, they moved into the cities. You guys learned back in 10th grade that industrialization led to urbanization. And as you had this increased labor pool, you were going to have problems for workers, because the more people out there looking for a job meant it was harder for workers to negotiate for better pay. More workers available meant each worker was less valuable. The whole mechanization of the United States economy also meant that workers were easier to replace because they could be trained easily. But there are also other cheap sources of labor. Remember, this is a time period of huge immigration into the United States. People we call the new immigrants, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Greeks, Italians, Poles, Russians, also people from China and Japan. And so that increased immigration led to a bigger labor supply, which again kept wages down. Not to mention, this is still a time period when child labor was being used. Speaking of child labor, as always, my top assistant James is here, and since he heard we were talking about workers, he decided to dress up as, the boss, the owner of a company. Guess he's going to fire me if I don't do well. He's rocking the suit, taking notes. So let's get back to our lecture. All right. Another big continuity that happened in the United States from 1870 to 1900 was this labor unrest. Lots of strikes. Lockdowns, picketing. So throughout the Gilded Age, one of the continuities you see is you'll see strikes. You will also see that in these strikes, the government would tend to take the side of management over labor, and very often these would end in violence. As you can see by this map here entitled Labor Unrest, 1870 to 1900, the pink areas are counties that reported strikes during the Gilded Age. You will see a couple that are deemed major strikes, the first being the Great Railroad Strike of 1877.
You have caused confusion and delay.
This affected railroad workers in Chicago, Pittsburgh, in Martinsburg, and Baltimore. In all, 11 states were affected by this railroad strike in 1877. 100,000 railroad workers went off work, and it was only ended when President Rutherford B. Hayes, the same guy whose election ended Reconstruction, sent troops in. Again, one continuity you'll see when it comes to these strikes is violence. A couple other big ones that we will discuss. One is the Homestead Strike, which actually should be called the Homestead Lockout in 1892 in Pittsburgh. That's going to involve Carnegie Steel. The Haymarket Riot in 1886 in Chicago, Illinois. That's going to involve the Knights of Labor. And the Pullman Strike in 1894, which would be a nationwide railroad strike that would involve a guy named Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union. But we'll get to those strikes individually in a bit. I want to give you a good example of not just workers and unions, but also the tactics that management would use to try to take away the rights of those workers. A very famous group was called the Molly Maguires. They were a notorious, and I say that word because that's the image that management would give, a notorious group of Irish mine workers. And of course, mining is a very dangerous industry. They were led by a guy named James McParland, and they were accused of all kinds of acts of violence and sabotage, so much so that mining companies would hire people from the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Agent Milton, Agent Ross, Pinkerton Detective Agency.
The Pinkertons, as they were called, would be used as spies. So you never knew if you were in a union meeting, there's that one guy in the back and he's actually paying attention in the meeting, because none of us pay attention in meetings. But if he was paying attention in the meeting and he's asking questions, you never know, he might be a Pinkerton spy. The Pinkertons would also be used as security guards. They would come in to break up strikes, beat up the workers, stuff like that. Well, and anyway, the Molly Maguires were so notorious that mine owners would fire anyone they thought could be a Molly Maguire. Law enforcement would go after anyone who was suspected of being a Molly Maguire. And that's the funky part. A lot of historians think maybe the Molly Maguires didn't exist. Maybe the mine companies made them up as an excuse to go after unions, because if you open your mouth, if you speak up too much, you know what? You might be labeled a Molly Maguire, and then that's the end of you. So again, the Pinkertons, the motto of the Pinkerton Detective Agency was "We never sleep." They started off by guarding trains, and they're going to become infamous for doing stuff like protecting scabs or replacement workers, for breaking up strikes, and we're going to talk more about them when we get to the Homestead Strike. Got a nice little slide we'll put up here for you. Management versus labor. And you have to understand that this was a back and forth struggle. Workers weren't helpless. Certainly the corporations, these trusts and monopolies, had a lot more power, had a lot more on their side than the workers, but there were some things that both sides could do. If you were management, if you were the people who ran a company, one tactic you could use to try to check the power of unions was to bring in scabs or replacement workers.
They have blatantly gone out and hired scabs.
These replacement workers would often be immigrants, and very often the striking workers would then start to direct their anger at the scabs instead of at their bosses who were bringing the replacements. In the South, African Americans would be used as scabs. In the North, it was immigrants. Oh heck, there was a famous incident one time in 1987. The National Football League went on strike. After 2 games, the NFL players went on strike, and the NFL owners tried to bring in scabs or replacement players, and it was the most awful football ever.
Coach would have put me in fourth quarter. We'd have been state champions, no doubt.
They called anybody who had a pulse. They even called this one guy up, tried to look for him, said, "Hey, do you want to try out?" And then they finally found out, nah, he's dead. He can't try out. So another thing that management would do were PR campaigns. They would try to label unions as un-American, associate unions as part of anarchistic groups. In the early 20th century, tie unions to Bolshevik or communist groups. We talked about the Pinkertons. Another tool that management would often use against workers was the lockout. And this is going to be directly associated with the Homestead Strike. In 1892, Andrew Carnegie locked out workers at the Homestead Steel Plant in Pittsburgh. Carnegie wanted the union broken. So what he did was he proposed a dramatic decrease in pay, and when the union refused, Carnegie's business partner, Henry Clay Frick, because Carnegie never wanted to get his hands dirty. He liked that cuddly reputation he had. People thought him as someone for the working man. Carnegie was off on a vacation in Scotland in a castle and told Frick, handle this. And Frick didn't mind getting dirty. So Frick locked out the workers, literally built a wall around the Homestead Steel Mill. People called it Fort Frick. And then brought in Pinkerton detectives to serve as security, not just for the fort, but then he tried to have these Pinkertons protect scabs. And what happened was, as the Pinkertons were being brought in, the striking Homestead workers met them with guns, even a cannon, and a massive firefight broke out. Eventually, the Pennsylvania militia came in, the locked out workers were run off, and were never able to work again. Another tactic that was used by management was blacklisting. If you were a union leader, you were someone who people thought was a troublemaker, your name would be circulated around the area on a, quote, blacklist, which basically meant don't hire this guy. So you were going to be shut out and your family was going to starve because you were on a blacklist. Another tactic used by management were yellow dog contracts. Yellow's the color of cowards. And a yellow dog contract simply was, if you want to work here, you need to sign this contract that says you will not join the union. Sometimes management would go get court orders or court injunctions ordering workers back to work. One famous court injunction was with the Pullman strike in the 1890s. George Pullman was the first man to design luxury railroad cars to make railroad travel more popular. He also created the idea of the company town, where, and I think my crack producer John right now will put a graphic up there kind of showing what a company town looks like. Pullman had his factory and the town be the same thing. So you worked in the factory, you lived in a house that you rented from the company, you bought your food and other supplies from the company store, your kids went to the company school, and if you were fired or no longer worked there, you didn't have a house, your kids didn't have a school to go to, and you didn't have supplies. Oh, by the way, you'd make your pay. By the time you paid your rent to the company, you bought your stuff from the company store, you had very little left over. Well, in this one incident, Pullman cut workers' pay but didn't cut rents, didn't cut prices at the company store. The workers went on strike, and they were led by a guy named Eugene Debs. Debs was the head of the American Railway Union, and Debs organized sympathy strikes. He said, look, railroad workers, the guys who hook up and operate trains, would not operate any trains that had Pullman cars on them. So basically we'll shut down the railroad industry if it has a Pullman car on it. So what the railroad owners did was they hooked up U.S. mail cars to these, Pullman cars to these U.S. mail trains. You see, it's a federal crime to interfere with the U.S. mail. Then they went to President Grover Cleveland, and Cleveland got a court order saying, Debs, you guys must operate these trains. You cannot interfere with the mail. When Debs refused, he was thrown in jail. Tools for labor. There were some things that labor could do. They could boycott. They could try to organize people to say, hey, don't buy products from this company. They don't treat their workers well. Sympathy demonstrations. Maybe our company's not on strike, but we're still going to protest and picket to show support for others. Organized strikes, where the union leaders would say, look, if our demands are not met by a certain time, we're all going to walk out. Sometimes there'd be what were called wildcat strikes. Something would happen in a factory, and all of a sudden the workers would just get angry and walk out. So there was something that both sides could do, but the deck was stacked against workers. It was always in favor of management. Here's a picture of a worker confronting a scab. Now, let's talk about some unions here. The first major union that you have to know, not just for the AP test, but for the Regents, is the Knights of Labor.
Who are you? We are the knights who say...
The Knights were founded in 1869, led by a guy named Terence Powderly. And the Knights were a union that got kind of radical, and they're a good example of what happens if you don't focus on a couple things. The big thing the Knights talked about was an 8-hour workday. They had a little slogan, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours to do as we please. If they had maybe just focused on the 8-hour workday, they might have been more successful. Ultimately, though, the problem was they wanted other stuff. They wanted workers' cooperatives, where workers own the companies. Nice, but harder to get. Worker-owned factories. Now you're really starting to uproot things. They wanted to abolish child labor and prison labor, which certainly noble. They wanted to increase the amount of greenbacks or paper money in circulation. Okay, now you're getting off topic. They wanted equal pay for men and women. Noble idea, but again, you're getting beyond your locus of control. More safety codes in the workplace. Okay, that one's pretty, connected to work. They wanted to ban foreign contract labor, where immigrants would be brought in for short periods of time to work and go home. In fact, the Knights were one of the biggest supporters of the Chinese Exclusion Act. They also wanted to abolish the National Bank. Well, again, instead of focusing on one or two things, the Knights got more and more, how do I want to say this, scattered. They allowed more intellectuals in, more people who were associated with radical groups, and that ultimately is what did them in. In 1886, the Knights met their maker in Chicago.
The Bears.
Workers for the McCormick Harvester Company went on strike, and the Knights of Labor decided to hold a sympathy demonstration in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And the police were brought in, and protesters clashed with the police, and we don't know who, but someone threw a bomb.
You can't say bomb on an airplane. Bomb, 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 bomb.
Into the middle of the crowd, and at the end of the day, several people were killed, including cops, and that was it for the Knights. 8 members of the Knights of Labor were arrested, were convicted, and in 1886, this Haymarket Square riot is what ended the Knights of Labor, because they were forever then associated with anarchists and un-American activity. The next big union that we'll talk about is the American Federation of Labor. And I've got a good picture here of their leader. This guy is Samuel Gompers. Gompers was the son of Dutch Jewish immigrants. By trade, Gompers was a cigar maker. Cigar making back then was, and really still is, considered to be like a very highly skilled job. You got to know how to roll things very tight. And because it was highly skilled, that meant people like Gompers were harder to replace. See, that's the big thing about industrialization. If you work in a factory and all you do is pull a lever, or you just push something along, and you don't have a lot of specific teachable skill, it's easier to find your replacement. But skilled workers, it takes more time and money to train them. They're harder to replace. And Gompers realized that. So the American Federation of Labor was what we call a craft union. And that's a really important term, a craft union, meaning only skilled workers could join. So no offense to the guy who pushes the broom or who pushes the big cart full of coal, but you're not coming in the AFL. Because in the American Federation of Labor, only skilled workers can join. Why? Because they had more negotiating power. Intellectual types, people with political aspirations, were not allowed in the AFL, as if the AFL learned from the mistakes of the Knights of Labor. The Knights struck when they had to. They preferred to mediate disputes with management instead of going on strike, and they used organized systems of union. They were highly organized at the national level, at the local level. They had a national strike fund where workers would pay into their union dues, and that way, in case there was a strike, workers could have some money. And they pushed for what were called closed shops, meaning only union workers could join. But the big tactic for the Knights of Labor was this idea of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when a union represents all of the workers. And I'll give you an example. I'm a member of the ESM United Teachers Union. All the teachers in our school district are represented by the same union. Individual teachers don't go into the district office and say, hey, I'd like to negotiate my contract. But what happens is we're all part of a union, and the union leadership negotiates stuff like salary and health care and stuff like that. And so the AFL was the first really successful union because they focused on what workers cared about the most: wages, hours, and working conditions. And if you think about it, I don't care where you work. If you work at a steel mill or you work at McDonald's, you care about how much money you make, how long you have to work, and what are the safe conditions that you work in. Those conditions are so important. They are what we call bread and butter issues. And that's a term that you have to know, not just for the AP test, but for the Regents. This idea of bread and butter issues, the most basic, simple issues that workers care about. All right, homestead.
There's no place like home.
Talked about that. And now understand, this is a time when corporate profits began to skyrocket, and the gap between the rich and the poor is going to start to increase as well. Here's a good graphic, producer John, of a company town. This is Pullman, Illinois. And again, the Pullman strike was broken up by President Grover Cleveland. No, John, not that Grover. This Grover, the fat guy president. Yeah, and he's from Fayetteville, New York. All right, now, some unions and some union leaders became more radical. And the best example I can give you, one you have to know for the Regents and the AP test, is Eugene V. Debs. Debs was the head of the American Railway Union. He was a big shot in another union called the IWW, the International Workers of the World. Debs was the five-time Socialist Party candidate. So he ran for president. He got involved in politics. He wanted to end capitalism. He wanted socialism in America. Debs was quick to go on strike, had no problem with going to jail. And again, in the early 20th century, he became a leader in the IWW, also called the Wobblies. Another union leader in the late 1800s, early 1900s was Mary Harris, aka Mother Jones. She was the organizer of the United Mine Workers. She once famously went toe-to-toe and negotiated with John D. Rockefeller. They called her the Angel of the Mines. Now, during the Gilded Age, union membership increased dramatically. I've got a pretty good chart I'll put up here for you. And I want you to pay attention to the top of the graph here. Look how the line starts to flatten out as we get around 1917. That's when America gets involved in World War I. By 1920, union membership had really kind of flattened and stagnated as America went into what was called the first Red Scare, the first fear of communist takeover. And that's important because corporations were able to paint these unions as un-American. And last but not least, if you take a look here, I've got a chart that shows you workers' benefits today, comparing healthcare, pensions, and disability insurance, comparing union members in blue and non-union people in gray. And so you can see there are still benefits to joining a union. Last one here, got a great chart that shows you membership in unions. In the 1930s, you see this blue part of the graph. This is the CIO. Members of the AFL began to break away in the 1930s, think the Great Depression, because they felt that unskilled workers had to be represented as well. And they were turned into a new union called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which we're going to talk about later on this year. By the 1950s, the AFL and the CIO merged back together to make a brand new union called the AFL-CIO, which is still around today and still, I think, the biggest union in the United States. Now, union membership is at question today here in 2024. In the early part of the 21st century, some states began to pass laws that made it easier to have non-union employees, what are called right-to-work states. A right-to-work state means you don't have to join a union, which is to the advantage of management. So you can see that chart here. And that's all you have for today. So again, remember, compare union membership with Gompers, bread and butter issues, to guys like the Knights of Labor and Eugene Debs. And for now, time to log off and put away your chromies, homies.